Bon appetit, ladies and gentlemen. I hate to disturb your focus on the food, but we're going to try something that I know we can achieve together, and that is talking and eating at the same time. So let's do it together. Forgive me for taking my jacket off, but it is quite hot in here, so I'm going to be jacketless for the next hour or so. We've got two elements to our lunchtime discussion. First, we're going to talk NATO, and then we're going to talk American politics, both, I think, extremely important and relevant to a meeting, a conference here in Kiev. So let's get straight down to it. And let me invite you to give a very warm welcome to Alejandro Álvarez González, who is one of the deputy leaders of NATO. He brings vast experience in international security to his role. He, of course, now spends a lot of his time considering NATO's present situation, but also NATO's future. And I think that's what I want to focus on with you, Alejandro, today. But first, ladies and gentlemen, please give Alejandro a very warm lunchtime welcome. And Alejandro, I hope you were able to join us this morning and hear President Poroshenko talk about his commitment to Ukraine's future in NATO, something that he's going to build into the, or he hopes to put into the basic law, the constitution of this country in the coming days. But I would put it to you that just as he is determined to paint a Ukrainian future in NATO, NATO is facing an existential crisis prompted by Donald Trump, but actually running much, much deeper. A deep concern in your most important member, the United States, that NATO is no longer working in the US interest. How do you tackle that existential crisis?
Let me start by saying that...
Hold it very close to your mouth, Alejandro.
Okay. I suppose that you do expect not to agree with your statement. I believe that NATO has still a lot to do and a lot of life in front of it, because it has been the organization that for the last 70 years has been able to deliver freedom, prosperity, and democracy to all its members, and even beyond that geography of European and North Atlantic allies. In fact, if you go to the founding principles, you will see that in those old times, the creation of both organizations like the European Union and NATO were felt needed because there was, by then, an existential crisis. And it is through these 70 years that we have discovered how both institutions could work in favor of those freedom, democracy, and prosperity in Europe. Again, we are in times of uncertainty. This is something which I believe it is quite clear, but nevertheless, you find, to use, I would say, you find in Europe still those two institutions that are ready to overcome this new situation. Let me say first, NATO has been able to stick to its principles for all that period. And those principles are the base of our strength. NATO has been able to adapt to very many different circumstances, to changing circumstances as today's. It is true, and you have mentioned so, that there are disagreements nowadays, but the story of NATO is also a story of very many disagreements in history. We disagreed, for instance, in Iraq. There was disagreements concerning the Suez Canal case, just to give you a few of them. What is true and everybody has in its mind is that only NATO can provide overarching and effective defense and deterrence for its members. Only NATO provides a place where North America and the European allies are able to debate politics and geostrategy. So I think that even though there are times of uncertainty, times with difficulties, the engagement of the allies in NATO has been proven already in this last summit in Brussels last July.
But if we if we accept the premise that NATO ultimately was built upon the Western desire to face down the Soviet Union, and that still today NATO's eastern flank and its perception of a Russian danger is the fundamental pillar of what NATO is about, then all we see is division, even within key members of NATO, thinking of, for example, Germany with its Nord Stream 2 commitments, thinking of Italy, which has a government today which wants to develop a deep friendship with Vladimir Putin, thinking of Turkey, which, goodness knows, on many different levels is out of sync with the rest of the NATO membership. This is an organization which it looks increasingly fragmented and dysfunctional.
Again, I have to disagree.
Which bit of what I've just said is not right?
I think probably everything. Let me go a bit beyond your thoughts. We are right now 29 members. We have different thoughts, different feelings and sensitivities concerning how we have to deal with some of the questions. But we also have a common base which is absolutely important. You've mentioned the case of Russia. Russia is a challenging scenario that provokes us on a daily basis, but there is also a common thought about Russia. And we have a policy which is sustained by all the members, which is one of deterrence and dialogue. Deterrence has two components. One of them is military capabilities. The other one is political will, even to use those capabilities if it is proven necessary. In the case of NATO, there is a third element, and this is unity. If there is no unity, there is no deterrence. All the member states have a clear idea on how this has to take place. And even though the discussion can go to the details, the main issues, deterrence, defense, and dialogue, are a common base for all of them.
Let us talk specifically about Ukraine. President Poroshenko is, as I said, quite clear about his and his nation's desire for NATO membership. But if we are to be honest, and there's no point fudging this, looking at NATO today, there is absolutely no chance in the foreseeable future of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, is there?
There is a decision, sorry that I'm being so I would say, orthodox, but I think we have to be, because Ukraine is suffering from a situation in which we have to stick to our basic principles and main compromises. And there is a compromise in Bucharest in 2008 that has been reconfirmed in Brussels in this last summit, to the point that we have even acknowledged, recognized the aspirations of Ukraine. There will be difficulties in the path towards this, but we all do hope that this will be a reality. In the meantime, we are following closely the way in which we can assist Ukraine, and we are doing so in assisting, in its reforms, which are deep, important, and are making of Ukraine a stronger country to face all the challenges that are well known.
But however successful the reform program in the coming years, as long as Russia still has its military presence, its interference in the affairs of East Ukraine, and as long as the annexation of Crimea stands, I'm struggling to see how a nation which, in essence, is still in a hot conflict with Moscow is going to be invited in to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Explain to me how that works.
Russia has indeed committed crimes against the international law in the last few years, starting especially in 2014, but also before that. And I could go back to 2008 and think of Georgia, just to give one example, one more example. Russia has this idea that it can not only interfere, but it can judge the situation and the future in international relations of any of its neighbors. And this we reject. We reject it to the point that I think a reflection is to be made. If they reject so, is because they feel that those countries getting closer to Brussels, if we can say it like that, they become a danger for them. The answer that they have to ask is why, or to put it in another way, I would say it's not NATO that has expanded to the east, but the east that has expanded to NATO because it sees a better guarantee to their security, their prosperity, and their democracy. And it is Russia that has to reflect on the elements that takes those countries to decide in that sense. And I think this is the basis of all the problem. And this is something that we have to sustain, the freedom of the countries to choose their own future.
Just a final point, which in a way takes us back to Donald Trump, and we're going to talk about the United States and its politics in a moment. But I might be more swayed by your presentation, full of optimism, full of talk of unity and coherence in NATO, if you could tell me that all of your member states are now fully committed in the short term, in the immediate future, to front up to their financial commitments and to their military preparedness commitments and do what the Americans have been asking, not just under the Trump administration, but for many, many years, to step up and play a full partnership role in terms of finance and military hardware. Can you tell me today that is going to happen in the short term?
I have no crystal ball. I can tell you what is happening already. In 2014, when the discussion on burden sharing took NATO to establish this 2% GDP dedicated to defense, only 3 countries in NATO were over 2%. Nowadays it's about 8, and we do have seen plans that the high majority of them will be in that 2% by 2024, which is the time that was established in 2014. So there might be difficulties. Maybe not all the countries will be there at due time, but there are efforts that are being done, and I believe that we will be in 2024 in a much better shape than we are today.
And when Angela Merkel says we can no longer rely on our partners across the Atlantic, we in Europe have to decide our own fate for ourselves, you seriously think that doesn't affect people's faith in the future of NATO?
Everything has an impact on the future of NATO, and opinions such as that of Angela Merkel, of course, do have an impact on the atmosphere that is being created or that can be created. But I would go to the reality, and this is to the summits and to the decisions that have been taken. In this last summit, more than 100 decisions were taken to provide more security to its member states. I do believe that even though Europeans and the European Union is doing an effort in that sense, have to reinforce their capabilities and their defense, and this will play for a better NATO. But I do not think that today anyone in Europe can think of a full security without NATO. You only have to see the figures, the spending, the capabilities, and some missions that took place in the past that had to be reinforced at some stage by NATO.
All right, Alejandro, I wish we could talk longer because we've scratched the surface of where NATO is today and where it's going. We perhaps have much more we could discuss, but we have to leave it there because not only do we have a lunch to eat, but we have another discussion to hold. So I thank you very much. Please,
thank you
ladies
very
and gentlemen,
much.
thank Alejandro Alva Gonzalez, and we invite you to enjoy your lunch, Alejandro. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you're being